The first thing Clara Whitmore saw that morning was the blood. It streaked the dust beside her fence line, dark and fresh beneath a pale Colorado sunrise, leading toward a motionless cowboy collapsed against a weathered wooden post. His horse stood nearby, trembling and exhausted, its reins tangled in the sagebrush. Clara almost turned back toward the farmhouse. Then the wounded man shifted, and the saddle slipped just enough for her to see the brand burned into the leather. Her heart stopped. She had seen that brand once before, 17 years earlier, on the ranch that had belonged to her father. It was the same crooked iron mark carried by the man Clara blamed for destroying her family. If you believe kindness can save a life, and that even broken people deserve a second chance, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in mercy, and subscribe to the Old West Archive for more stories from the forgotten frontier. Clara stood frozen beside the fence, one hand gripping the wooden post. The morning wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and pine from the distant hills. For 17 years, she had imagined the man who ruined her family in 100 different ways. Sometimes he was a cruel outlaw with cold eyes and a black heart. Sometimes he was a wealthy rancher who had used money and influence to steal everything her father owned. In her darkest memories, he was the reason her father died with shame in his eyes, the reason her mother became a ghost of herself, and the reason Clara had spent most of her adult life working a lonely piece of land that should never have been hers. His name was Silas Vane, and his brand was burned into the memories of everyone who had survived those years. Yet the wounded cowboy lying at Clara's fence was not Silas Vane. He looked too young, perhaps 30 at most, with sun-browned skin, dark hair stiff with sweat, and a deep gunshot wound beneath his ribs. His clothes were covered in dust, and one sleeve was torn nearly to the shoulder. There was dried blood along his jaw, and his breathing was shallow. Whoever he was, he had been running from someone, and he had run until his horse could go no farther. Clara's first instinct was fear. Her second was anger. But then she saw his hand trembling against the dirt, and something inside her refused to let him die there simply because the saddle beneath him carried a hateful name. She brought him inside. It took nearly an hour to drag him across the porch and into the small bedroom her mother had once used. Clara cut away the blood-soaked cloth, cleaned the wound with boiled water, and pressed a strip of linen against the bullet hole. She had learned enough from years of surviving alone to know how quickly a wound could become a grave. The cowboy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes gripping the blanket as if fighting an invisible enemy. Clara worked quietly, never taking her eyes completely off him. When he finally opened them, they were filled not with the arrogance she expected from a man connected to Silas Vane, but with exhaustion and something that looked dangerously close to fear. That frightened Clara more than anything, because cruel men rarely looked afraid. For 3 days the stranger remained between life and death. Clara gave him water one spoonful at a time, changed his bandages, and slept in a chair beside the door with a loaded rifle across her lap. She searched his pockets but found very little: a small silver watch, a folded photograph, a knife, and a torn piece of paper bearing a name she recognized. Samuel Whitmore. Her father's name. Clara stared at the paper until her hands began to shake. Her father had been dead for 17 years. On the 4th morning, the cowboy finally became conscious enough to speak. His name was Daniel Vane. The name struck Clara like a bullet. Vane. She nearly reached for the rifle. Daniel saw the hatred in her face, and did not try to defend himself. Instead, he slowly pulled the silver watch from his pocket, and placed it on the blanket. Clara recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her father. She remembered it from childhood, remembered watching her father's thumb rub the cracked glass whenever he was worried. Her father had worn it the night men came to their ranch, and accused him of stealing cattle. The night everything changed. Clara demanded to know where Daniel had found it, and the answer forced her to sit down. Daniel told her that Silas Vane had been his father. For 17 years, Clara had believed Silas had died somewhere far from the valley after taking her family's land and reputation with him. She had never imagined that he had left behind a son who carried the same blood, the same name, and apparently the same cursed saddle. But Daniel had not come to Clara's ranch because he wanted anything from her. He had come because he had discovered the truth about what his father had done. The story was worse than Clara had ever known. Her father's ranch had not been lost because Samuel Whitmore was a thief. He had been framed. Silas Vane had wanted the Whitmore water rights because a new railway route was being planned through the valley. He had paid 2 men to move cattle across Samuel's property, then arranged for forged documents to make it appear that Samuel had stolen them. When Samuel protested, Silas used his influence to make the accusations believable. The bank called in the Whitmore debt. Their land was seized. Their cattle were sold. Clara's mother became sick from the strain, and Samuel, unable to bear the humiliation, died before he could clear his name. Clara had spent 17 years believing her father had failed. Daniel had spent 30 years believing his father was a powerful man who could never be wrong. And both of them had been living inside lies. Daniel told Clara that after Silas died, he found an old trunk hidden beneath the floorboards of his father's study. Inside were ledgers, letters, payment records, and documents proving exactly what Silas had done. Daniel had spent months trying to uncover the truth and return what remained of the Whitmore property. But his father's former partners had discovered what he was doing. They wanted the evidence destroyed and Daniel dead. That was why he had come wounded to Clara's fence. That was why the saddle carried his father's brand. Clara wanted to believe him, but 17 years of bitterness did not disappear because a wounded stranger told her a painful story. She had learned that trust could be more dangerous than anger. So she kept Daniel locked inside the farmhouse while she rode into town to search for records. What she found made her blood run cold. The old bank ledger contained missing entries that matched the dates Daniel had given her. The names of men who had worked for Silas were still written in the county archives. Most importantly, a survey map showed that the Whitmore ranch had once included the very stretch of land Clara now struggled to maintain. Her father had not failed. Someone had stolen his future. That night, a storm rolled over the mountains. Lightning flashed beyond the windows as Clara sat beside Daniel, holding her father's watch in her palm. She had spent years believing that justice meant seeing Silas Vane punished. But Silas was dead. His enemies were old. His victims were gone. Nothing could return the 17 years Clara had lost. Then Daniel looked at her and told her something that broke through the anger she had carried for half her life. He said he was sorry. Not because he personally had committed the crime, but because he had benefited from the family name that had caused her pain. He had grown up on money stolen from people who never had the chance to defend themselves. He had ridden horses bought with dishonest wealth and slept beneath a roof built partly from another family's ruin. He could not change the past, but he could refuse to continue it. Clara did not forgive him that night. But she stopped hating him. The next morning, they rode together toward the old Vane ranch. Daniel could barely stay in the saddle, but he insisted on going. Hidden beneath the floorboards of his father's abandoned study was the final piece of evidence, a packet of letters that could prove the forged documents had been created deliberately. Clara carried the rifle. Daniel carried the map. Between them lay the weight of 2 families, and 17 years of unanswered questions. They reached the ranch near sunset. The place was almost empty. Wind pushed through broken windows, and the old barn leaned toward the earth. Clara remembered hearing stories about this place as a child. Her father had once warned her never to come near it. Now she understood why. Daniel found the loose floorboard beneath the study desk, but before he could lift it, they heard horses outside. 3 riders. Then 4. The men who had chased Daniel had found them. Clara's fear returned, but this time it was not the helpless fear of the little girl who had watched her family's life collapse. She was older now. She had survived 17 hard years. She knew the land, the weather, the trails, and the places where a horse could disappear into the hills. She and Daniel escaped through the back of the ranch house with the evidence hidden beneath Clara's coat. They rode through a narrow canyon as gunfire cracked behind them. Daniel's wound reopened, leaving blood on his shirt, but he refused to stop. Clara could hear the riders closing in. Then she remembered something her father had once taught her. When the trail is impossible, stop following the trail. Clara turned her horse toward the river. The canyon narrowed until there was barely enough space for 2 horses. The pursuers followed, believing they had trapped them. But Clara knew the riverbed opened farther downstream. She and Daniel crossed through the shallow water, hid beneath an overhang, and waited while the men rode past. For the first time in 17 years, Clara realized she was no longer running from the past. She was carrying it toward the truth. By the time they reached town, Daniel was nearly unconscious. Clara brought the evidence to the county judge, who had been young when Samuel Whitmore was accused. The old man recognized the handwriting in the letters immediately. Within days, the story that had been buried for nearly 2 decades began spreading through the valley. Former employees of Silas Vane came forward. Old records were reopened. The forged documents were exposed. The Whitmore name was cleared. But justice did not come with trumpets. There was no magical moment when Clara suddenly received everything she had lost. The land could not restore her childhood. It could not give her mother back. It could not bring Samuel Whitmore home. What it gave her was something quieter. The truth. And sometimes, the truth is the first piece of a broken life that can be put back where it belongs. Daniel recovered slowly. He stayed on Clara's ranch because he had nowhere else he wanted to go. At first, Clara treated him like a stranger. Then, little by little, he became a friend. He repaired the fence where she had found him. He rebuilt the old barn. He helped bring water to the dry southern field. He never asked Clara to forgive his father. He never defended the Vane name. Instead, he spent his days trying to make his own name mean something different. Months passed. One spring morning, Clara stood beside the fence where Daniel had first collapsed. The grass had returned, green and soft after the winter. Wildflowers grew along the posts. Daniel's horse grazed nearby, and the old saddle was hanging inside the barn. Clara walked toward it and ran her fingers across the burned Vane brand. Once, that mark had represented everything she hated. Now it reminded her of something else. A person is not always responsible for the sins committed before they were old enough to understand them. A family name can carry shame, but a human being can choose what that name means next. Daniel had not erased her father's pain. He had simply refused to add another generation of hatred to it. And Clara finally understood that forgiveness was not pretending the past had never happened. Forgiveness was refusing to allow the past to own every tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that people can change and that kindness can sometimes reach places anger never can, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear that message, and subscribe to the Old West Archive. Your support helps keep these emotional stories of the Old West alive. Years later, people in the valley still remembered the wounded cowboy who appeared beside Clara Whitmore's fence. Some remembered the gunshot wound. Some remembered the stolen documents. Some remembered the Vane brand on the saddle. But Clara remembered something different. She remembered the moment she could have turned away. She remembered seeing the name of the man who had ruined her family and having every reason to leave his son in the dirt. And she remembered choosing mercy. Because sometimes the greatest victory over the people who hurt us is not revenge. Sometimes it is becoming the kind of person they could never be. Clara kept her father's watch until the day she died. Daniel kept the old saddle, but he eventually removed the Vane brand from its leather and replaced it with a simple mark of his own, a small open gate. When someone asked him why, he explained that a gate could be closed by fear or opened by courage. And Clara believed that was the real story of her life. A wounded stranger came to her fence carrying the name of the man who destroyed her family. But he left behind something far more valuable than revenge. He left her the chance to choose what happened next. And that was the day Clara Whitmore stopped living inside the tragedy her father had suffered and finally began living for the future he had once dreamed of. Before we end, I want you to do something special. If Clara's choice to show kindness instead of revenge meant something to you, comment, "I choose kindness," below. Let that simple sentence be a reminder that even after the hardest chapters, we still have the power to choose what comes next. Because the Old West was filled with guns, greed, betrayal, and bloodshed. But sometimes, the most powerful weapon a person could carry was a heart that still knew how to forgive. 3 years had passed since Clara Whitmore found the wounded cowboy beside her fence, but there were some nights when she still woke before dawn with the sound of gunfire in her dreams. The valley had changed since the truth about Silas Vane became known. The Whitmore name had been cleared, the stolen land returned through a long legal battle, and Clara's ranch had finally begun to prosper. The old farmhouse had been repaired, the barn stood straight again, and wild grass covered the fields that had once been nothing but dust. Yet Clara had learned that peace did not always mean forgetting. Sometimes peace meant learning to live beside the memories without allowing them to control you. Daniel Vane had become part of that new life. He worked the ranch from sunrise until the stars appeared, and although he rarely spoke about his father, Clara knew that the Vane name still followed him like a shadow. He had earned the trust of the people in the valley slowly, one honest day's work at a time. But on a cold October morning, a stranger arrived at Clara's ranch carrying a message that threatened to reopen everything they thought they had buried. The man appeared just after sunrise, riding a tired gray horse with a long coat pulled tightly around his shoulders. Clara saw him from the porch and immediately noticed something strange. He did not ride toward the front gate. Instead, he stopped beside the old fence where she had discovered Daniel years earlier. He sat there silently, staring at the ground as if searching for something buried beneath the dust. Clara reached for the rifle leaning against the porch and walked toward him. The stranger was older, perhaps 60, with a scar running from his left eyebrow down toward his cheek. His eyes were sharp and restless. When he finally looked at Clara, the color seemed to drain from his face. He asked whether she was Samuel Whitmore's daughter. Clara said yes. The stranger slowly reached inside his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. He told her that he had known her father. Clara felt the old wound inside her chest open again. The man's name was Thomas Reed, and he had worked as a bookkeeper for Silas Vane 17 years earlier. Clara had heard the name before. Thomas Reed was mentioned in one of the documents Daniel had found, but there had been no record of what happened to him after Samuel's ranch was taken. Clara invited him inside, but she did not lower her guard. Daniel was away in town delivering cattle, and she had learned long ago that a peaceful morning could become dangerous without warning. Thomas placed the wooden box on the kitchen table. Inside was another pocket watch. Not Clara's father's watch. A second one. Thomas explained that Silas Vane had given it to Samuel Whitmore on the night before the accusations began. Samuel had discovered that someone was stealing money from the railway investment fund and had confronted Elias about it. Samuel believed the theft was connected to the land scheme, but before he could expose the truth, Elias moved against him. Thomas had been too frightened to testify back then. He had watched an innocent man lose everything, and had spent 17 years carrying the guilt. Clara stared at him, unable to understand why he had returned now. Then Thomas said the words that made her blood run cold. Silas Vane had not acted alone. There had been another man behind everything. A man who had never been exposed. Thomas told Clara that Elias had been the face of the conspiracy, but the money, the forged documents, and the pressure on the bank had come from a powerful businessman named Silas Crowe. Crowe owned interests in the railway company, and had wanted the entire valley's water rights. Elias was simply the man he used to make the Whitmore family disappear from his path. Clara immediately thought of Daniel. If Silas Crowe had survived all these years, he might know that Daniel and Clara still possessed evidence that could destroy everything. Thomas opened the wooden box again. Beneath the watch was a folded piece of paper. Clara unfolded it. There was only one sentence written across it in faded ink. "He knows the boy is still alive." Clara's fingers went numb. "Daniel,"